You're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Shaun Haney here with Real Agriculture for a special episode of the Ag Policy Connection podcast. I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, our nation's capital. We got a fun panel after day one of the Canadian Agri-Food in a Sustainable World conference that's hosted by CAPI. It was a great day, a full day, dedicated 100% to the topic of sustainability from, honestly, a number of different angles. And we covered a lot of ground, a lot of perspectives, all the way from the farmer, all the way through the value chain, and a lot of information shared and perspectives. We had some really good debate on the stage and also some agreement, some disagreement. And I really enjoyed myself. And what we're going to do now is we're going to do a wrap-up, like I mentioned. We've got a great panel here today. Up first, we've got Darlene McBain with Farm Credit Canada. Darlene, it's great to have you.
Thanks, Shaun. Thanks for having me.
What do you do at Farm Credit?
Shaun, I'm Director of Industry and Stakeholder Relations at Farm Credit Canada, so I work with industry stakeholders all across the value chain, all through the country. And I guess one of my key objectives in my role is to really understand what's going on in the industry and making the connections of where are those key challenges and opportunities and how do that relate back to FCC's strategy of how we can advance Canadian agriculture and food.
I've always thought that your role at FCC and in the industry is a very cool one.
Oh, it is.
I feel a little bit similar in the sense that you get to see the industry from so many different angles, right? So many different perspectives. You're not just locked into livestock or crops. You see horticulture. You see the whole gamut. Absolutely. It's a great role because we do get to see the full picture and really understand the macro of agriculture and what's going on out there and really being able to connect those dots of some of the interesting conversations and what do we need to do as an industry to move forward. Great stuff. Okay, also joining us is Sara Kate Smith from Clear Strategy, based in Toronto, Ontario. Sara, great to have you on the show here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, what is Clear Strategy and what do you do?
Amazing. So we're a public affairs firm. We work across the sustainability, food, beverage, and agriculture and tech spaces. We're a newer team, almost 3 years old now, but really focused on, a team of people who've worked in industry, in-house at different businesses to really kind of bring the outside in for clients, supporting their public affairs activities and supporting how they're showing up and engaging with stakeholders to really shape their operating environment beyond just traditional GR.
Always challenges in public affairs.
I mean, it's an exciting space. That's why I like working in it. I think we always have, new things coming up. And I think especially in the agriculture space, it keeps us on our toes. And it's a really interesting file to be able to work on.
Yeah, very cool. Well, it's great to have you here. Also joining us, familiar face to Real Agriculture and the Ag Policy Connection podcast because it is Tyler McCann, Managing Director at CAPI. Tyler, great to chat with you.
Shaun, it's great for you to be with us. I feel like I should be welcoming you to the Ag Policy Connection because
I know
I've been here before, but I think that this is your first time on this great podcast partnership that we have.
Yeah, I'm really filling some pretty big shoes here. Kelvin Hepner, the usual host of this podcast, was unable to be here today. He's harvesting, he's combining, totally understandable. We'll forgive him. I feel very fortunate to be here today and be able to moderate one of the sessions. Really had a good time. So, yes, filling in for Kelvin does a great job. Okay, so
but I think, Shaun, we should say this is the time when we say, listeners, feel free to write in and say whether or not Shaun or Kelvin does a better job hosting the Ag Policy Connection.
Well, I ran into quite a few fans today that were in attendance of the Ag Policy Connection podcast. Actually, just at the reception, somebody walked up and said, I love that podcast. I listen to it all the time. It's fabulous. And I hear you're doing more episodes, which more to come on that. Okay, let's talk about today. I guess my first question is, we covered sustainability from a number of different angles. I'm curious what you personally learned today. What was a take home for you that you learned from today? And Tyler, we'll start with you.
I think one of the messages that resonated to me, and I'm not sure that it's not something that new that I learned, but that was really clear was that sustainability can really be an opportunity for Canadian agriculture and food if it's done right. I think there's a lot of debate and dialogue around whether or not we're doing it right today. What does doing it right mean? What does it look like? But clearly, you look at these opportunities for wins between producers and their bottom line, value chains that are looking about how do we add value, differentiate ourselves in the global marketplace, how do we find solutions to the struggles that are there. This can really be a good thing, but we need to think a lot better and a lot differently about what we're doing and how we approach these issues to make sure that we're doing it right. And again, I think that there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the discussion today around how we need to change what we're doing today.
Hey, Darlene, how about you?
Well, Shaun, I think I learned a lot today. Actually, we heard
you were the MC, by the way.
I was the MC, and we did have a jam-packed agenda today with a lot of great perspectives from different sectors of the industry. We heard from farmers, as you mentioned. We heard from business owners. We heard from international stakeholders from countries around the world. We heard from different sectors outside of agriculture and food. And what I learned today, I think my biggest takeaway is, although we're all very different and we have very different perspectives, I think we're all faced with the same tension and challenges. And I think at the end of the day, we all did see, like Tyler just mentioned, there is an opportunity ahead of us that we can actually move forward and achieve great things if we all put our minds to it and work together and collaborate and try to find some common ground. Although there are many differences, if we find some common ground to move forward together, I think we will be able to get to have our industry in a great place in continued conversation.
Yeah. Okay, Sara, how about you?
I mean, I think what Darlene captured around the common ground, I think that's kind of what stood out today is we had this conversation around sustainability. There's a lot of different, interests and approaches within the ag sector itself in Canada. But I think it was interesting to see what some of the commonalities and the places that people were, nodding in agreement in the audience when people were talking about beyond just that kind of core topic of sustainability. We heard people talking about the need for extension services and the power around kind of that grassroots advocacy when it comes to engagement. We heard a lot of commonality around, the importance of investment and the importance of, really kind of engaging, where producers are at. And part of that is the regionality of ag in Canada. And so I think it was interesting to kind of see, as we're talking about sustainability as a whole and trying to find, the places where we're aligned and overlapping, it was really interesting to see the other kind of supporting factors and outcomes that come along with this work that started to emerge.
Okay, so all three of you mentioned the opportunity. So what is the opportunity?
So I think it depends, Shaun, right? So in some situations, the opportunity is how do we reduce input costs, right? I think fertilizer often comes up. There was a discussion today about the fertilizer targets and effectively how the federal government kind of screwed that up. But one of the ways they could have done it right is talked about how if we're smarter and more efficient about fertilizer use, farmers are going to be more profitable. We're also going to potentially reduce nitrous oxide emissions. That can be a secondary benefit. But in the meantime, we can improve the profitability of farms. We did hear that, there's a lot of concerns and questions about how much consumers are willing to pay, but there are market opportunities to differentiate a sustainable product. There is kind of these value chain solutions. We had a speaker from General Mills that's talking about the work that they're doing with farmers to ensure that they're sourcing more sustainable products and how that's returning benefits to the farmers. So there's some real concrete, tangible opportunities. Clearly, we also heard about concern and threat and the risk that this could be done wrong. But, I think that we know these things. It's just a matter of how do we actually kind of put the systems in place to prevent these unintended consequences from happening.
Darlene, it seems like at times one of the roadblocks here is that we trying to invent a process or a system where it's the same to everybody. That is just that feels almost impossible. And I'll just compare agriculture to, say, forestry or airlines. Okay, so if we're talking about airlines, for the airline industry to be sustainable, we've got two major airlines and a few minor carriers. Their issues are, in their environment, are the same. They're even using the same aircraft, bought by Boeing or Airbus or whatever. So it's easy for the industry to get their head wrapped around sustainability and get on the same page and do the speak with one voice thing. This industry is way more diverse than that. Soil, weather, what crops being produced, the livestock. And I think that's the real challenge for us in this area.
Absolutely. Agriculture and food's complex, right? We're working with value chains. We're working with different sectors, different commodities, different geographical areas in the country. Producing food, producing grain in Ontario is not the same as producing grain in Western Canada, as you would know, Shaun. So how do we bring together all of the different commodities and groups across the country to perhaps find a path forward, but while maintaining each individual commodity group or production zone, their own, right? Their own path forward. You need to keep that discrepancy across the value chain to move forward, because the realities aren't the same across the country. So yes, it is very complex, but we need to drive value also as an industry. And I think we need to have a common message to move forward together and to get to the point where we're collaborating with one another, speaking the same voice, and driving some of impact. We need to work together also. We need to come together on certain areas.
Yeah, you made me think of don't let complexity be be up to the challenge.
Exactly.
We can't stop because it's complex. So there's a lot of complex problems in our industry. Trade is complex. Just producing the crop in period is complex. We don't stop in those situations. We shouldn't. We should be willing to tackle big topics. Is what I feel. So one voice. I said this, and we were talking before we started. Are we able to talk with one voice with so much complexity and so much regionality differences?
I mean, I think the challenge with one voice and kind of the watch out for that approach is, yes, it comes with, the impact of having the full industry, but there is the risk of the message that one voice is delivering becoming diluted in order to really get buy-in from everyone that you need. And I think, it's interesting when we're talking about this, because I think, the message behind that one voice is just having, the right people all coming to the table at the same time. And I think that was what, we heard from the panelists today, is that there's still the need to show up and to participate and to be there. And in lieu of being able to identify that one voice, we can't, wait until we can align on one point, and we can't hold out from showing up to these consultations and participating where we're needed, and continually putting agriculture at the forefront of the decisions being made in order to find that silver bullet, because I don't think there is one when it comes to the sector.
So Tyler, in my panel I alluded to, and I got a few chuckles from the crowd, I mentioned code of conduct, and so one of the challenges with the code of conduct we had in responsible grain was the fact that it was trying to be everything to everybody and everything under this umbrella, and we realized that was really hard. We see in the U.S., like American Soybean Association, they've got their own sustainability program. Would we be better to do it commodity specific and this is what works for pulse crops, this is what works for dairy, and all sustainability initiatives don't need to be the same?
So I think what we heard this morning from someone from the Australian Farm Institute, and Australia's really done some really interesting work around their sustainability framework that attempts to try and build on those commodity-specific frameworks that exist. There was a dairy framework, a meat framework, and tries to build on the common themes across them. But I think really what it comes down to, and I think was one of the responsible grain issues, was what is the value proposition? Why are we actually doing this? At the end of the day, is it about a market opportunity where there is going to be a value proposition? And I think if you compare responsible grain to verified beef, where there is support and there is buy-in, there was just this fundamental difference that on the beef side, there's a value proposition for the people that are involved. And so you see more support, you see more engagement, you see a more constructive, positive dialogue. But I think one of the things that we heard is, again, there are going to be situations where there's a value proposition, but there's also going to be situations where there isn't. And we have to be really honest and transparent about, there are times when sustainability doesn't matter. If you are shipping grain into certain Asian markets, or maybe the Middle East is a better example, right? They're going to do a tender, and they're going to care about price, and they're not going to care what the carbon footprint of that grain is. But that's not all grain buyers. And so you do need to have a more thoughtful conversation to understand it depends. And sometimes there's a value proposition, sometimes there's not. Sometimes you need on-farm data. If you're a canola grower shipping to the EU today, we heard today that there's going to be a 12-month delay on their EU deforestation regulation. But that is a real kind of present danger for our value chains in Canada. We need evidence. We need data. We need to be able to tell our sustainability story. But that's not everything. And again, I think that's where it's not just even a commodity by commodity kind of decision. It's a market by market decision. It's a value chain by value chain within commodities. And we need a kind of a more thoughtful approach that way.
That's a great point. So we focus so much on the sustainability from the standpoint of the differences here in how we define it and how we produce it. But it actually is the same thing happening at the export point too. It's how that buyer defines what is sustainable. And that's going to be different in France and Germany versus Australia versus China and India.
But I think one of the things that we heard from the international panel this morning is that, in Europe, maybe not Europe, certainly in Australia, certainly in the U.S., government often plays a supporting and enabling and facilitating role. I think in Canada, in the policy context on sustainability, government got out in front of everybody else and kind of messed things up and complicated things. And I think we need to go back to how do we get government to do a better job recognizing that really what it needs to do is support, facilitate, and enable the work that the value chain is doing to respond to those needs and to kind of deliver that sustainability improvements that are good for farmers, that respond to customer needs at the end of the day.
One of the roadblocks I think that comes up often, I know it came up in my panel, and Darlene, you emceed today, so you probably heard this a lot throughout the day. Well, how do we define it?
Absolutely.
That comes up so much in this discussion. Yeah. I've told audiences in some of my speeches when this question comes up, we need to get past that. It's going to be different. We don't have to have one definition to move forward. We need to move past that. Is my thoughts. What were you thinking as you were hearing people mention that all throughout the day?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, the conversation around the definition came up quite a few times, Shaun, like you mentioned. And I'm still not clear at the end of today that we did agree, actually.
Probably won't.
Right? Like we didn't agree on should we make sustainability our number one competitive advantage, the panel that you moderated today, which was a really, really great debate. But I think, there's different reasons. I think that the definition of sustainability differs from person to person or from commodity to commodity or from, right? Because different folks, like Tyler just mentioned, are looking at sustainability from a different lens. Some are looking at it from a trading perspective. Some are looking at it from a consumer-driven perspective. So the way that you're looking at it, you may be looking at, the definition of sustainability for different purposes. And for some, it may be, the ESG. The definition of sustainability is ESG. For others, it might be financial viability of their farm, right? They look at their farm as, I want my farm to be sustainable to move into the future so that my children could, grow food on this farm for, generations to come. So it's depending who you're speaking to, you're going to hear that. And I don't think that today we got to that. I do think, though, that today the conversation took us one layer deeper into that definition and to what this means, not only from different individuals' perspective, but for our actual whole sector perspective.
Sara, we're not taking callers to this show, but I will say if we were, what a caller would say is, hey, I'm Joe from Melville, and my question is, who's going to pay for this? Right? I think that's something. And Joe from Melville or Cam from Chatham, that's the question they have. I know it came up on my panel. There were some perspectives on that, but what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think, what we heard from that panel was, it's not so much, who's going to pay for this, but what are the investments that can be made to really drive those efficiency gains and those changes. And then I think, really identifying the fact that it's not a silver bullet, it's not a clear line of, okay, one investment from, one stakeholder group or one, area of government will really fix these things. I think it's that collaborative approach where we're allowing for the innovation and investment required. But I think, what was interesting that we saw on that panel as well, and I think to Darlene's point that she just made too, is that concept of sustainability as it related to, succession within the industry. And, that role we heard of, is sustainability a competitive advantage for succession planning and for engaging youth back into agriculture, onto the farms. And I think, that highlights, one of the key points we heard today as well, is that it's not just about, the environmental sustainability of that piece, it's the economic sustainability. That's what, makes it, a smart career choice, a smart investment choice for youth looking to move back into the industry or to take over their parents' farms or find that capital to become a new entrant into this space. And I think it's that was the example that really stood out to me of, we can't just be talking about sustainability as, this one piece that, is a sales pitch. It has to be grounded in that actual fulsome meaning of sustainability, that we're going to have, succession and youth also investing in the sector. I think if we're going back to who's paying for it,
right,
it's the next generation. It's this current generation of youth and new entrants who are going to be dealing with, the landscape in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, dealing with the impacts of the regulation we're seeing now, dealing with the impacts of the decisions industry is making now. And so I think it's also looking ahead a little bit as we're broadening our understanding of sustainability to, include those components for the sector.
But I think there's also, if Joe from Melville was on the phone, it would be good to be able to ask him, who paid for that first no-till drill that he bought? Right? Because that is probably one of the greatest things that he's done from a sustainability perspective, is to stop summer fallow, stop turning the sod over all of the time, and invest in that no-till bit. He probably did that on his own because it made sense and it was good for his bottom line, and it saved him fuel and time and because the business case made sense.
He didn't feel like it was being shoved down his throat, though.
That's right. That's right. But I think that it gets into, we need to stop thinking about this as it's being shoved down our throats. So many of the things that farmers across this country are doing every day are improving their sustainability, and they're not asking anybody to pay for it. They're doing it because it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, what you just said there, Tyler, because I don't think we have to look at, and it was said today on one of the panels, we have to stop looking at this as this ultimate goal that we want to attain and look at it like from day to day. Farmers have always done what was right on their farm to advance their farm, to make sure that they are making their soil richer every day, ensuring that next year's crop's going to be good. So they're going to continue. The farmer is going to organically continue to invest into his farm. So it's not the farmer that's going to pay for the investment of this future state of sustainability. I think it's an all-encompassing industry-wide collaboration that is going to drive us forward, but it's going to be done step by step by step, right? So farmers are going to continue to do what they've always done, right? The industry is always going to remain invested because they want to continue to grow the food and produce the food to sell it to, foreign markets or to sell it domestically and have the great products on the grocery shelf to be competitive and remain competitive. And the whole industry is going to want to invest in becoming more efficient, more productive, because we know we need to drive more productivity into the way we grow food for that competitive piece. So it's just going to continue to happen, and I think it's going to be a lot of people investing in different ways, and it's not only just about the money, although I do work for FCC, and we are going to, enable investment into our industry. But yeah, I think it's that collaboration piece and a whole holistic way of approaching moving forward together.
So as you're saying that, Darlene, I agree. And I think the people or the narrative that has been created that treats sustainability as if it's something that we could just, if only Indiana Jones was here to like find this holy grail of achievement and bring it back home and tell us what to do, we would just be light years ahead. And that's not exactly what we're dealing with here. It's much more... It's just not one thing. It's multiple layers of systems and methods, and the way that we do things in agriculture that we're chasing here. Without saying it's complex, it is complex. Go ahead.
But one thing it is definitely not is a 30% fertilizer emission reduction target, and it is definitely not a sustainable agriculture strategy. But what it is all of the things that farmers will do to reduce their fertilizer emissions by 30%. That makes sense for them because it's the right thing to do, because it drives down the cost of fertilizer.
Yep.
So again, we need to kind of, so much of, I think our challenge today is that we've let policy get in the way of things that just make sense.
Right.
That we need to change our way of thinking about this, and we need to get past, again, there was a debate today about is sustainability an outcome or is it this process? And again, the sustainability is not we're using 30% less fertilizer. The sustainability is we're doing a better job producing more with less. And that's something that people are doing every day, and we need to not realize that that's a bad thing.
So let's use the example that comes up all the time is minimum till, zero till. And we get amnesia because we talk about that sometimes as if that just happened overnight. And if you talk to the people like that worked at RTK Tillages, I think was the organization, Innovative Farmers in Ontario that really worked to move that movement ahead, the spirit of it, it took years. And Sara said it, extension. Mm-hmm. There was extension there was infrastructure put around that concept. And farmers were doubtful at the beginning. It's sort of like straight combining canola. It just didn't happen, right? You had to prove it through research, through practical examples, through smart farms, through provincial extension networks, through private agronomists. It took a long time to move that needle, and some of the practices we're talking about here will be the same, and some have to prove themselves out. And some will succeed and some will fail. Cover crops do not work everywhere, but they work really good in some spots. And that's okay.
And they probably work some places where farmers think that they don't, right? Right? We got to kind of figure that out too.
Rotational
right?
grazing's another one. I think there is some other examples, yeah.
So I like your example of it takes time, right? This no-till concept took time to have the buy-in and the high percentage of what was the number 90? What's the number of not using no-till in Canada?
In Saskatchewan it's like 90%.
90% and more. Well, I think today was sort of a piece of that. I think today was like peeling off the layers of an onion and like getting deeper into the onion of like. We're taking it step by step, and conversations like we had today, Tyler, I think were my closing remarks was, I think it's conversations like we had today where we dig deeper into these topics with different perspectives, that this is really valuable discussions that will help bring the industry to the next step and then keep moving forward, and building on these conversations is really going to be the great next step for the right.
But no-till I think is an interesting example in that, because it came up today that no-till just wasn't that new tillage equipment became available. Pesticides became available too, right? Like we often celebrate the success of no-till what we should be celebrating is the success of no-till and Roundup Ready.
Combined with pesticides.
Multiple puzzle pieces came together.
Yes. Right? And I think, again, we don't, pesticides, herbicides, not everybody's favorite topic, but they are those innovations that are going to come, that are going to change the way we do business, that are going to change, if you look at the potential with gene editing and what that means, right? This is some pretty exciting stuff that maybe not tomorrow, but sometime soon is going to change how we farm. We need to understand that again, that innovation piece is a really important piece of the puzzle. And again, I think that we heard that, this morning, one of the speakers talking about the kind of the experience across the Americas and looking at what's happening in South America really kind of got into that role that innovation and those new products and access to those products and systems that make it possible to bring those products to market really plays an important role.
We can't, as an exporting nation, we can't ignore what the so we have to pay attention to what the customer is doing. So what does Japan define as important when they're buying Canadian beef? Okay, or what does India think about pulses, or lots of examples. But it's also what are the countries that we are competing with doing, because we can't lose sight of that. No different than we're managing a baseball team or a hockey team. You got to keep an eye on everybody else that's in your division, what they're doing to make sure that you can beat them at the ultimate competition that you're involved in. And so with beef or pork, we have to pay attention to what the Americans are doing, or we need to pay attention to what the Australians are doing. And I think sometimes we get sort of locked in this. What is Canada going to be? And how do we define this? And what are we going to do? Well, what exactly is our competition doing is also a critical piece of this. I think that we lose sight of that from time to time. Is that fair?
Absolutely. We can't do this in isolation. Agriculture is a global market, right? We trade every day, and we just can't ignore what's happening in countries around the world because, like you just said, Shaun, I think some of those countries could get ahead of us, and we don't want that to occur, and we want to make sure that we're staying on top of how we're evolving in this space. And making sure that we're actually looking at what, either our customers or our competitors are doing so that we remain relevant in what we're up to.
But that same way of thinking matters domestically too. And so if you look at the companies that Sara and her team work with that are like food processing or, consumer packaged good companies that are looking at what do their value chains look like, where are they sourcing products from, this isn't just an issue about kind of the beef market in Japan. This is about, what does Coca-Cola care about in the Canadian context too? And I think people forget about that often.
I think people also forget that Canada and Canadian agriculture is also vast. I think we, even from province to province, from region to region, maybe we're not always the best at looking to what's going on in those other places and taking those learnings. And I think even within Canada, I think we had, the forestry industry represented here today, which is, near and dear to my heart, having also grown up in forestry. And I think it's really being able to take those learnings from the other sectors that are close to the work that we're doing to close to, working in a similar Canadian political and regulatory landscape and trying to pull from those learnings. And I think, we heard about it a lot today, the regionality tying back to sustainability. If you look at, something like cover cropping doesn't look the same in Saskatchewan versus other, areas of Canada. And so how are we really pulling on that knowledge that exists, within Canada, within our supply chains? And I think that's something, that we prioritize, in the work that we do is really, having that producer feedback directly. And I think that's, been a really crucial part of how we approach anything is having that on the ground knowledge and that regional knowledge. And I think, even when we're talking about how sustainable change is kind of occurring in Canada, that regional knowledge is what facilitates that innovation and whether or not it makes sense on your farm, in your area, in your province. And so I think it's trying to figure out, how do we, as we're looking towards, these transitions with sustainable practices, transitions with farms, as, our average Canadian farmer is not getting any younger, and how are we also transitioning that regional knowledge and that on the ground knowledge that farmers have? Because I think that's so crucial to sustainability because it's so tied to, the soil environment that you're in and the climate that you're in and really being able to draw on that. So I think, this is just a lot of, obviously we need to look around and learn from everyone, but I think it's starting at the ground level and starting at that regional level to be able to make these sustainability programs successful where they are.
I'd agree with you. Just sharing the knowledge across our country, within our country, and that's a great starting point. So we're ensuring that we're not reproducing the work that may be done in research in Western Canada, innovation that's happening in Western Canada, and we come here to Eastern Canada and they may be doing the same thing, but they're not talking to one another. So how do we ensure that we're all talking to one another and that we're advancing at the same pace and learning from one another?
Yeah. Well, I always say, also leverage in Manitoba, leverage data from North Dakota, Alberta, Montana, Michigan, Ontario. That's another thing we need to. If the work's being done, let's square it and double down on it.
But too many people, Shaun, think that Canada's an island and we're different than the world, and we need to move past that.
One of my personal missions is to change that.
Well, and this gets back to kind of the theming of the day and how we approach some of the work that we do at CAPI. How do we put Canada in a better global context, right? This is Canadian agri-food in a sustainable world. This isn't. We need to understand what's there, right? And we brought some of those global perspectives in this morning because we need to really understand that a lot better than we do.
I got a very good friend that, when you end a discussion like this or a day like this, he always says, okay, so what? Now what? Okay, so that's how we'll finish up this discussion. Now what? What if you had your way, if you had, it was all on your shoulders, what would you like to see happen next in this topic in Canada to push this forward? Because Canada's great at the consult, great at talking about it, but we sometimes lack some action. We like to talk about stuff, the consult, the building consensus. So let's have some action. Now what? Who wants to dive into that one first?
So I think we put sustainable value chains first, and we need to understand that those solutions that are going to help sustainability are going to be different, and so we need to kind of think differently and realize that this really never mind just regionality, right? This depends on markets, and so this cannot be one size fits all. This should not be a program that just offers 3 on-farm solutions. This needs to be a program that says we're going to be really flexible and think about what does a beef producer need versus what does a vegetable producer in Southern Ontario need versus what does a small-scale food processor in the interior of BC need, and going to recognize that we need to be a lot more thoughtful about those specific value chains, specific needs, and act differently that way.
Yep. Sarah?
And I think, building on what Tyler said, if we're going to get thoughtful and differentiate, the next phase of identifying what works for those, specific value chains, those specific sectors, is then the measurement of it and being able to verify those, the impact and be able to report out on it. And I think that's where the investment comes. That's where the opportunity to scale and build those next steps comes, is if you're able to measure it. And so it's getting those systems that work and then being able to prove it out and demonstrate really clearly, okay, this is working, this is a system we can invest in, and we can prove out, the next steps and the impact that it's having.
Yeah, moving from that qualitative story to the quantitative, that's powerful.
It's crucial.
And if I could just jump back in to say that, again, I think that Sarah's got a really great point, right? The solutions are going to be different, but the need to report, need to measure, report, verify is going to be the same. Yeah. So it's a good example. It's going to be different, but the same.
Yeah. I can't do new math, never mind sustainability math. So leave that up to the really, really smart people.
Well, you mentioned taking action, Shaun, and I think, the next piece in taking action is exactly what Sarah said, is we need to start proving out with data and facts and figures and move forward. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to boil the ocean here, but I think we just need to progress day by day, and through time, we will get to a place where we will see results from that progress that we're making on a day-to-day, start measuring, start telling that story, and then, like Tyler, you just mentioned, positioning Canada as a global leader. We need to start there, and that, I think, is the best next step.
Tyler, I'm going to give you great thoughts from everybody. Tyler, I'm going to give you, as managing director at CAPI, this has been your day. It's been a great one. Give you the final thoughts.
I think that there's a lot of work to do. I think something that comes up across almost all of the work that we do that I'm increasingly focused on is like, things are really good in Canada, but things could be a lot better. And I think that we need to do a better job of recognizing that the status quo isn't good enough anymore. And I think that that's really true on the sustainability perspective. And I think that that is one of the messages that I took away is, again, like, we do a good job, but we could do a better job. And we need to put a lot more thought into what does that look like. So that's kind of the message that I'd leave everyone else with. Again, Shaun, maybe just to kind of end by saying thank you for stopping by the Ag Policy Connection. I'm not sure Kelvin has to worry about the permanent hosting duties of the podcast, but maybe that's a discussion for after.
Well, we will definitely have a discussion after. This has been a great opportunity. I really appreciate it. It was fun to moderate the panel today, have a little bit of some spice up there as people didn't agree on everything, which I always like in a panel. I hope everybody enjoyed this episode of the Ag Policy Connection podcast. Sara Kate Smith from Clear Strategy, Tyler McCann from CAPI, Darlene McBain from Farm Credit Canada, and myself, Shaun Haney of Real Agriculture. Stay tuned for more episodes of the Ag Policy Connection podcast. Cheers, everybody.